The night was alive with the hum of city life, cars honking, distant chatter, and the occasional wail of sirens slicing through the air. Marcus Johnson sat in the driver's seat of his ambulance, scrolling absent-mindedly through his phone while waiting for the next call. He had been a paramedic for nearly a decade, long enough to know that calm moments like these were rare. His partner, Sarah, sat beside him, sipping coffee from a thermos. They joked about their last shift, a wild ride involving a cat stuck in a tree and an overly dramatic owner, but their laughter faded as the radio crackled to life. Unit 47, we have a report of a multi-vehicle collision near 5th and Main. Possible injuries. High-profile individual involved. Respond immediately. The dispatcher's voice was clipped, urgent. Marcus didn't waste a second. He flipped on the sirens and hit the gas, weaving expertly through traffic. Sarah grabbed the mic to confirm they were en route, her tone professional but tinged with concern. High-profile individuals meant extra attention, extra pressure, and sometimes unnecessary complications. As they sped toward the scene, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping into his chest. It wasn't just the weight of responsibility. He'd handled countless emergencies before, but something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way the dispatcher emphasized high profile, or maybe it was the restless energy buzzing in the streets. Whatever it was, he pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task ahead. Lives depended on him staying sharp. When they arrived at 5th and Main, the chaos was palpable. Shattered glass glittered under the streetlights, and twisted metal lay scattered across the road. A luxury sedan rested precariously against a lamppost, its front end crumpled beyond recognition. Police cars formed a perimeter around the wreckage, their flashing lights painting the scene in harsh reds and blues. Bystanders gathered behind barricades, whispering and pointing, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones. Marcus hopped out of the ambulance, his medical kit slung over one shoulder. He scanned the area quickly, taking stock of the situation. There were no visible victims outside the vehicles, which likely meant someone was trapped inside. As he moved closer to assess the damage, he noticed the tension in the air. Officers barked orders at each other, their body language stiff and defensive. Something about the atmosphere made him hesitate, but only for a moment. This was his job, his calling. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to do what he did best, save lives. Little did Marcus know, this routine call would spiral into something far more complicated and dangerous than anything he'd faced before. As Marcus approached the wreckage, his focus was solely on the task ahead. His years of experience had taught him to block out distractions and concentrate on what mattered most, helping those in need. But before he could take more than a few steps, a sharp voice cut through the noise. "Hey, you there. Stop right where you are." Marcus turned to see a young police officer striding toward him with an aggressive gait. It was Officer Daniels, a rookie whose reputation for impulsiveness had already made waves within the department. Daniels' hand hovered near the holster on his belt, his posture tense and confrontational. Marcus raised his hand slightly, showing he meant no harm. "I'm a paramedic," he said calmly, gesturing to the ambulance behind him. "We got the call about the accident. I'm here to help." But Daniels wasn't listening. His eyes narrowed as he studied Marcus, his expression hardening. "You match the description," he snapped, stepping closer. "We've got reports of someone fleeing the scene after causing this mess. Don't move." Marcus frowned, confusion washing over him. "What are you talking about? I just got here. Look at my uniform. I'm trying to do my job." He pointed to the ambulance lights still flashing behind them, hoping it would jog some sense into the officer. But Daniels wasn't swayed. If anything, his demeanor grew even more hostile. "You think I don't know how these things work?" Daniels shot back, his voice rising. "People like you always have excuses. Well, not tonight." Without warning, he lunged forward, grabbing Marcus by the arm and twisting it behind his back. The sudden movement caught Marcus off guard, and pain shot through his shoulder as Daniels shoved him roughly against the side of the ambulance. Sarah rushed over, her face pale with shock. "What are you doing?" "He's a paramedic. We're here to help," she shouted, trying to intervene. But Daniels ignored her, barking orders for her to stay back. Bystanders began murmuring among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record the altercation. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Marcus struggled to keep his composure despite the unfairness of the situation. "Officer, please," he said, his voice steady but strained. "There's been a mistake. Let me explain." "No explanations," Daniels interrupted, yanking Marcus' arms tighter. "You can tell it to the judge." With that, he slapped a pair of handcuffs onto Marcus' wrists, ignoring the growing protests from Sarah and the crowd. Marcus winced as the cold metal dug into his skin, his mind racing. How could this be happening? All he wanted to do was help, yet here he was, treated like a criminal. The injustice of it all burned deep inside him. But Marcus forced himself to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. It might even make things worse. As Daniels finished securing the cuffs, he leaned in close, his breath hot against Marcus' ear. "You should have thought twice before messing with this city," he growled, his tone laced with disdain. For a moment, everything seemed surreal. The flashing lights, the shouting voices, the weight of the handcuffs. It all felt like part of someone else's nightmare. Marcus clenched his jaw, refusing to let despair take hold. Somewhere nearby, someone needed his help, and until he could prove his innocence, he'd have to trust that the truth would eventually come to light. As Daniels tightened his grip on Marcus, the sound of faint but urgent cries pierced the tense atmosphere. At first, it was easy to miss, just a soft whimper barely audible over the chaos of the scene. But as the seconds ticked by, the noise grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from inside the ambulance. Daniels paused mid-sentence, his brow furrowing in confusion. For a moment, he loosened his hold on Marcus, glancing toward the vehicle with suspicion. "What's that?" he demanded sharply, his voice cutting through the night air. Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. His hands were still cuffed behind his back, and his frustration had reached its peak. Sarah, however, stepped forward hesitantly, her eyes wide with concern. It's the patient," she stammered, pointing toward the open doors at the rear of the ambulance. "We stabilized them before we got out here. They're hurt. They need care." Her words came out rushed, almost pleading, but Daniels wasn't convinced. Instead, his expression hardened further, his jaw tightening as if he suspected some kind of trap. Without another word, Daniels yanked open the back doors of the ambulance, peering inside with narrowed eyes. What he saw made him freeze completely, his body going rigid as though someone had flipped a switch. There, lying on the stretcher, was Mayor Evelyn Carter, the city's first black female mayor and one of its most beloved public figures. Her face was pale, beads of sweat dotting her forehead, and her breathing was shallow. She looked fragile, vulnerable, a stark contrast to the powerful image she usually projected. For a split second, no one moved. Daniel stood rooted to the spot, his mouth slightly agape as recognition dawned on him. The mayor blinked slowly, her gaze shifting between Daniels and Marcus. Despite her obvious pain, there was a flicker of clarity in her eyes, a quiet strength that refused to be diminished. "Officer," she croaked weakly, her voice strained but commanding nonetheless. "What is going on here?" Daniel swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly as he struggled to find his voice. He glanced down at Marcus, who was still handcuffed beside him, then back at the mayor. The pieces began falling into place, and the realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just any accident victim. It was her. And the man he'd accused, the man he'd treated like a criminal, was the very paramedic who had saved her life. Mayor Carter turned her head slightly, locking eyes with Marcus. Recognition softened her features, and a small, grateful smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "You," She whispered, her voice trembling but full of gratitude. "You helped me. Thank you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, as Daniel's face turned an alarming shade of red. The officer took a step back, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of his mistake. He fumbled for something to say, anything that might salvage the situation, but the damage was done. Every pair of eyes at the scene, the bystanders recording on their phones, the other officers now watching silently, even Sarah, was trained on him. Daniels had gone too far, and everyone knew it. Marcus, still restrained, kept his composure despite the absurdity of the moment. He didn't gloat or lash out. Instead, he simply met the mayor's gaze with a calm nod, acknowledging her thanks without saying a word. Inside, though, his heart raced. He knew this moment would change everything, for better or worse. The silence that followed Mayor Carter's words was deafening. Daniel stood frozen, his face pale, and his hands trembling slightly as the gravity of his actions crashed down on him like a tidal wave. The mayor, though weak and injured, exuded a quiet authority that filled the space around them. Her simple thank you to Marcus wasn't just an expression of gratitude. It was a dagger to Daniel's pride, exposing the absurdity of his behavior for everyone to see. Daniel stammered, his voice barely above a whisper at first. "And Madam Mayor, I didn't realize." He trailed off, unable to finish his sentence. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by sheer panic. He glanced toward Marcus again, guilt flashing across his face as he realized the man he treated like a criminal was actually a hero in this moment. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, not the officers standing nearby, not the bystanders with their phones recording every second, and certainly not Mayor Carter herself. Mayor Carter shifted slightly on the stretcher, wincing from the pain, but refusing to let it silence her. "Officer," she said firmly, her voice stronger now despite her condition, "this man saved my life. If he hadn't acted quickly when I was pulled from the car, I wouldn't be here right now." She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "And yet, here we are, with him in handcuffs while I lie here needing further care." Her words landed like a punch, leaving Daniels visibly shaken. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Instead, he fumbled with the keys in his pocket, finally managing to unlock the cuffs binding Marcus' wrists. As the metal clinked to the ground, Daniels muttered another apology, his voice cracking under the weight of his embarrassment. "Sir, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. I didn't know." Marcus rubbed his sore wrists but didn't say anything immediately. He simply nodded curtly, his expression unreadable. Inside, however, emotions swirled: anger, frustration, relief, and even a hint of pity for the young officer who now looked like he wanted nothing more than to disappear into the night. Marcus chose not to dwell on it. There were more pressing matters at hand. Sarah stepped forward, breaking the tension. "We need to get the mayor to the hospital," she reminded everyone, her tone firm but professional. "She's stable for now, but she needs proper medical attention." Her words snapped everyone back into action. Officers began clearing a path for the ambulance, and paramedics rushed to assist Marcus and Sarah in preparing the mayor for transport. As they worked, Mayor Carter spoke up once more, her gaze steady and unyielding. "This isn't about me," she said, addressing the crowd that had gathered. "It's about what happens every day to people who look like Mr. Johnson, to black men and women who are judged not by their actions, but by assumptions based on the color of their skin." Her voice carried a quiet power, drawing nods of agreement from some in the crowd, and uncomfortable shuffling from others. Daniels hung his head, unable to meet her eyes or anyone else's. For the first time in his career, he understood the impact of his actions, or rather, his reactions. It wasn't just about one bad decision. It was about the ripple effect such decisions could have on individuals and communities. He felt small, insignificant, and utterly ashamed. Meanwhile, Marcus focused on doing what he did best: caring for his patient. As he helped lift the stretcher into the ambulance, he allowed himself a brief glance at Mayor Carter. She gave him a faint smile, her eyes conveying both gratitude and solidarity. In that moment, Marcus knew this incident would spark conversations far beyond the confines of this chaotic night. But for now, all that mattered was getting her safely to the hospital and ensuring she received the care she needed to recover. By the time the ambulance pulled away from the scene, the story was already spreading like wildfire. Bystanders who had recorded the incident began uploading videos to social media, and within minutes, hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #AccountabilityNow were trending across platforms. The footage showed everything: the aggressive arrest, the mayor's intervention, and Daniel's stunned reaction. It painted a vivid picture of what had happened, leaving little room for interpretation or denial. Back at the crash site, Daniel stood motionless as reporters arrived, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward him. Other officers tried to shield him from the growing crowd, but it was too late. His face was unmistakable in the videos, and soon enough, his name was plastered across news headlines. Reporters shouted questions about racial profiling, police misconduct, and whether the department planned to take action against him. Daniels looked overwhelmed, his earlier bravado replaced by sheer panic as he realized the magnitude of the backlash. Mayor Carter, still en route to the hospital, became the center of attention once again, but this time not because of her political achievements. Her calm yet firm words at the scene resonated deeply with people. Social media users praised her for standing up for Marcus, calling her a true leader and an ally. News outlets played clips of her thanking Marcus and confronting Daniels, highlighting how she used her platform to call out injustice even while injured. Meanwhile, Marcus found himself caught in an unexpected spotlight. As they drove to the hospital, Sarah glanced at him, concern etched on her face. "You okay?" she asked softly. Marcus sighed, leaning back against the seat. "I've been through worse," he admitted, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But yeah, I'll be fine." He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Stories like this rarely stayed contained. They always spiraled into something bigger. And spiral it did. By morning, protests erupted outside City Hall, drawing hundreds of demonstrators demanding accountability for Daniels and systemic change within the police force. Signs read phrases like "Black Lives Matter" and "Enough is enough," while chants echoed through the streets. Community leaders joined the march, urging calm but firm action. Even some city council members publicly condemned Daniels' behavior, calling for transparency and reform. At a press conference later that day, Mayor Carter addressed the public from her hospital bed, flanked by doctors who assured everyone she was stable and recovering. Though visibly exhausted, her voice carried strength and conviction. "What happened last night was unacceptable," she began, looking directly into the camera. "No one should ever be treated the way Mr. Johnson was treated, especially when they're simply doing their job. This isn't just about one officer making a mistake. It's about patterns of behavior that have gone unchecked for far too long." She went on to announce plans for immediate investigations into Daniels' conduct, as well as broader reforms aimed at addressing bias and improving trust between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Her speech earned applause both in the room and online, with many praising her for using her influence to push for meaningful change. As for Marcus, he chose not to press charges against Daniels, despite encouragement from colleagues and supporters. "It won't bring real change," he told Sarah later that evening. "What we need is bigger than punishing one person. We need systems to work better, for everyone." Still, he agreed to speak at upcoming community forums organized by local activists, hoping his story could inspire dialogue and progress. Daniels, on the other hand, faced suspension pending investigation. Overwhelmed by shame and public scrutiny, he avoided speaking to the press, retreating into silence. Some speculated he might resign altogether, unable to bear the weight of what he'd done. But regardless of his fate, one thing was clear: Marcus' quiet dignity and Mayor Carter's unwavering support had ignited a movement. one that wouldn't fade anytime soon. The days following the incident felt like a whirlwind for everyone involved, but none more so than Marcus Johnson. What had started as a routine emergency call had turned into a national conversation about race, accountability, and justice. The video of Daniel's aggressive behavior toward Marcus and Mayor Carter's powerful intervention had gone viral, sparking outrage and calls for reform not just in their city, but across the country. Community leaders wasted no time organizing protests and rallies, drawing crowds that spilled into streets and parks. Signs bearing messages like "End racial profiling" and "Justice starts now" dotted the landscape, while speakers took turns addressing the masses. At one such rally, Marcus was invited to speak, a request that initially made him uneasy. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, let alone standing before hundreds of people expecting answers or inspiration. But after some encouragement from Sarah and Mayor Carter herself, he agreed. Standing on the makeshift stage, Marcus gripped the microphone tightly, his knuckles white. For a moment, he simply looked out at the sea of faces staring back at him. There were young students holding banners, parents with children perched on their shoulders, elderly folks leaning on canes, all united by a shared desire for change. Taking a deep breath, Marcus began to speak. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I didn't wake up that morning thinking I'd end up handcuffed at the scene of an accident where I was trying to save someone's life. But here we are." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This isn't about me. It's about all the other black men and women who've been treated unfairly because of how they look. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I went through." His speech struck a chord with the crowd, earning thunderous applause. People chanted his name, holding their fists high in solidarity. Marcus stepped down feeling both drained and empowered, knowing his story had resonated deeply. Meanwhile, Mayor Carter continued using her platform to push for systemic changes within law enforcement. She called for mandatory bias training, body cameras for every officer, and independent oversight committees to review cases of misconduct. Her proposals gained traction quickly, with several council members pledging support. But the pressure mounted on Daniels, whose suspension became fodder for heated debates on news channels and social media. Some defended him as a rookie who had made an honest mistake, while others condemned his actions as emblematic of larger issues within policing. Overwhelmed by guilt and public scrutiny, Daniels eventually submitted his resignation letter, citing personal reasons. In a brief statement released through the department, he apologized again to Marcus and Mayor Carter, acknowledging the harm he had caused. As the dust began to settle, Marcus found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. The incident had forced him to confront emotions he'd long buried: anger, frustration, even fear. Yet it had also shown him the power of resilience and community. Strangers approached him at grocery stores and gas stations, thanking him for speaking out and sharing their own stories of discrimination. Each encounter reminded him why he couldn't stay silent. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, Sarah joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You've become kind of a symbol, you know," she said with a small smile. Marcus chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I don't want to be a symbol," he replied. "I just want to do my job without worrying about whether someone's going to see me as a threat instead of a helper." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that's exactly why people look up to you," she said, "because you're still willing to help, even after all this." Marcus didn't respond right away. Instead, he sipped his coffee, letting the warmth spread through him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. Hopeful that maybe, just maybe, his experience could pave the way for something better. Something lasting. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the incident continued to spread, touching lives far beyond Marcus and those directly involved. The city buzzed with a mix of tension and hope as reforms began taking shape. Mayor Carter's proposals weren't just empty promises. They quickly gained momentum. Thanks in part to the overwhelming public support for change, community meetings were held across neighborhoods, bringing together residents, activists, and law enforcement officials to discuss ways to rebuild trust and accountability. One of the first major steps was the introduction of mandatory implicit bias training for all police officers. The program wasn't optional. It was comprehensive, designed not only to educate, but also to challenge deeply ingrained attitudes. Officers attended workshops where they heard firsthand accounts from individuals who had experienced racial profiling or discrimination. Marcus himself was invited to speak at one session, sharing his story without bitterness, focusing instead on how misunderstandings could escalate into dangerous situations. His calm demeanor left a lasting impression on many officers, some of whom approached him afterward to apologize personally, not just for what happened to him, but for similar incidents they'd witnessed or been complicit in. The mayor also pushed forward legislation requiring body cameras for every officer on duty, while some within the police department resisted, arguing it would infringe on their privacy. The majority of citizens supported the move. Footage from these cameras would now be subject to regular audits by an independent oversight committee, a group made up of community leaders, legal experts, and representatives from marginalized groups. This measure aimed to ensure transparency and hold officers accountable when misconduct occurred. Daniel's resignation became a turning point for the department. Though he faded from public view, his actions served as a cautionary tale during training sessions. His name came up often, not to shame him, but to highlight how unchecked biases could lead even well-meaning individuals astray. Some former colleagues expressed sympathy for the pressure he faced, while others felt his departure was necessary to restore faith in the force. Either way, his case underscored the urgent need for reform. For Marcus, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, though nothing about his routine felt quite the same. He still responded to emergencies, still worked long shifts alongside Sarah, but now there was an added layer of awareness. People recognized him everywhere he went. Grocery stores, gas stations, even traffic lights. They thanked him for standing tall despite adversity, for refusing to let anger define him. At first, the attention unnerved him, but over time, he grew accustomed to it, even finding comfort in knowing his story inspired others. He also embraced his new role as an advocate for change. Invitations poured in from schools, churches, and community centers asking him to share his experience. Marcus didn't sugarcoat anything. He spoke honestly about the fear and frustration he'd felt that night, the injustice of being treated like a suspect rather than a professional. But he always ended on a hopeful note, reminding audiences that progress was possible if people worked together. Sarah noticed a shift in him too. "You seem lighter," she remarked one evening after a particularly grueling shift. Marcus smiled faintly, leaning back against the ambulance bumper. "I guess I am," he admitted. "It's exhausting carrying all that weight around. But seeing people come together, actually wanting to make things better, it gives me hope." Even Daniels found a path toward redemption, albeit quietly. Unable to face returning to law enforcement, he began volunteering at a local youth center, mentoring teenagers from underserved communities. It wasn't glamorous work, and he rarely spoke about his past, but those close to him noticed a change. He seemed determined to learn from his mistakes, using his experience to guide young people away from prejudice and toward empathy. As the city moved forward, cracks began to heal, not perfectly, not overnight, but steadily. Conversations once avoided were now happening openly. Bridges once burned were slowly rebuilt. And through it all, Marcus remained a symbol of resilience, proof that even in moments of injustice, courage and compassion could spark meaningful change. Months had passed since the night that changed everything, and while the scars of the incident still lingered, they no longer felt as raw. Marcus Johnson sat in his usual spot in the ambulance, scrolling through his phone during a rare quiet moment. The headlines were different now, less about outrage and more about progress. Stories highlighted new policies implemented by Mayor Carter's administration, success stories from community policing initiatives, and testimonials from citizens who felt safer because of the changes. For Marcus, life had settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and transformed. He continued his work as a paramedic with the same dedication he'd always shown, but now there was an added layer of purpose. Every call reminded him of why he chose this profession, to help people when they needed it most. And though he still encountered moments of tension or misunderstanding, they were fewer and farther between. Officers he worked with seemed more mindful, more willing to listen, thanks in part to the reforms and training programs put in place. One evening, after wrapping up a shift, Marcus drove home under a sky streaked with orange and pink hues. As he parked outside his modest apartment building, he noticed a small crowd gathered near the entrance. At first, he thought something might be wrong. A medical emergency, perhaps, but then he saw the signs. "Thank you, Marcus," one read. Another said, "Heroes like you inspire us." His neighbors stood there smiling, holding flowers and homemade cards, their faces glowing with gratitude. Marcus stepped out of his car, stunned. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. A young girl ran up to him, thrusting a bouquet of daisies into his hands. "We wanted to say thank you for being brave," she said shyly before darting back to her mother's side. One by one, others approached him, sharing how his story had touched them. Some spoke of loved ones who had faced similar struggles. Others simply expressed admiration for the way he handled adversity with grace and dignity. Tears welled up in Marcus' eyes as he listened, overwhelmed by the outpouring of kindness. For so long, he'd carried the weight of that night alone, unsure if anyone truly understood what he went through. But standing here now, surrounded by people who cared, he realized he wasn't alone anymore. His story had connected with others in ways he never anticipated, reminding him of the power of vulnerability and resilience. Later that week, Marcus attended a ceremony hosted by Mayor Carter to celebrate the city's progress. She stood at the podium, her presence commanding yet warm, and announced the launch of a scholarship fund named in Marcus' honor. The fund would support students pursuing careers in healthcare and public service, ensuring that future generations would have opportunities to make a difference. When she called Marcus to the stage, the room erupted in applause. He accepted the recognition humbly, using the moment to remind everyone that real change came not from individuals, but from communities working together. As he left the event that evening, Marcus reflected on how far things had come. Daniel's resignation had once seemed like the end of the story, but it turned out to be just the beginning. The former officer's decision to volunteer at the youth center had inspired others to seek redemption in their own lives. Meanwhile, Mayor Carter's leadership had galvanized the city, proving that even deeply rooted issues could be addressed with determination and collaboration. Driving home under a starlit sky, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of peace. He thought about the challenges ahead. There would always be setbacks, moments when hope felt distant. But he also knew the city was stronger than it had been before. People were talking, listening, and learning. Lives were being saved, not just physically, but emotionally and socially too. When he finally pulled into his driveway, Marcus took a deep breath, savoring the quiet. Tomorrow would bring another shift, another chance to serve. But tonight he let himself rest, knowing that even in moments of darkness, light could shine through. And sometimes, that light came from unexpected places.